I'm Grayson Moore with former members of Congress, and I'm here with former Congressman Don Manzulllo. He recently released his book, Do Nice Guys Run for Congress? How an Obscure Country Lawyer Kept His Faith, Beat the Establishment, and Survived 20 Years in Congress, which is available on Amazon, both hardcover, paperback. You can download it on your Kindle.
Actually,
so lots of options.
The best place to get it is at my website, www.donmanzullo.com, and there every copy is personally autographed.
Oh, awesome.
And I send it out that way. So
there you go. So scratch Amazon, go do that for people who are watching.
Thank you.
So my first question is, in your book, you said you started writing several years ago, but you were not happy with the first draft and let it go cold. Other than capturing your legacy for your children and the various audiences you described in the beginning of the book, what made you pick up the draft again recently and finish the book last year?
Well, I started out, it ended up almost being like a textbook. I mean, textbooks are expensive, they're hardcover, and they're boring. And I didn't like it at all. And actually, I made a draft, and I went to Pete Weckland there at the former members, and I said, I need help with this. I need direction. The first thing he asked was, who is your audience? Really, really good advice. And so the audience would be my kids, because I could give them a written legacy. Obviously, they don't know everything that I did. It would be to people who have a passion for learning about the ethics and the inside view of what goes on in Congress. It's another audience in there really is people that have reading and learning disabilities. Bad case of ADD. You remember those tests in school where it was called a comprehensive test, comprehension test, where you would read something, then you would turn the page and answer questions. I mean, if there was a grade lower than F, I couldn't do that. Absolutely could not do that. But it's a long story, and it's spelled out in the book here on overcoming a lot of learning and retention disorders and learning how to work with that, and using that in the end as a gift rather than a disability.
You talk about how you translate concepts into pictures in your mind.
Yes, everything is a picture. When I was in my senior year at American University, I read this little pamphlet by a fellow by the name of Dr. Bruno First, F-U-R-S-T, and he taught how you can memorize lists of things. And for example, number one would have a key word that's attached to that, and then you would easily memorize those words. Then you would use those words, which were all nouns, to paint your picture inside of it. And it was just amazing how I was able to see from one dimension to actually in four dimensions, because it created a picture of what I was trying to envision, and that picture was not limited by space. So, I'm definitely a picture man.
Yeah, it was really interesting to read in your book how you even like passed the bar through that. So for those watching, definitely check it out. So moving on a little bit, for those who don't know Northern Illinois, can you talk to them a little bit about the congressional district you represented?
Yes.
You know, what industries are there? Where is it? The towns, that kind of stuff.
Our congressional district ran from the Mississippi River and hugged the state of Wisconsin, all the way to within one county of Lake Michigan. Heavy agriculture, corn, beans, beef cattle, hogs, heavy manufacturing in Rockford, Illinois alone. City about 150,000, the county's about 250,000. at least 1,300 factories or manufacturing facilities. Add to that the suburbs of Chicago into McHenry County, which sits right on top of Cook County. A lot of people who commuted into the city, people involved in financial services, but a very, very interesting congressional district. I spent my time mostly working on manufacturing issues because I could see stuff like that with my ADD. But it was, I mean, we had to know all issues. And then once every 5 years, we had to relearn the dairy issue. Then we would talk to Congressman Steve Gunderson from Wisconsin, who was an expert on it, and we took his advice.
Yeah. The dairy margin program eludes many Congress people. So, so one of the through lines through your book is and you talk about this very early, is how your dad, you talk about your dad and his small businesses and how he operated them and really went out of his way to help people. Can you share how his actions or one of those stories shaped how you operated in Congress?
Dad had a small grocery store in a pretty rough part of Rockford, Illinois, in the southeast part. He had a bus stop in front. This was from 1948 to 1953. And people were coming from displaced persons camps in Europe. A lot of people from Lithuania, Ukraine, and at that time, there was a massive crop failure in Arkansas, drought. And so people would come to the grocery store, get off, come into my dad's store, and as long as you had an accent, either Ukrainian or either European or Arkansas, he would extend you credit for the groceries. And he had hundreds and hundreds of these little booklets where people would come in with no money, and he would extend them credit. He got paid most of the time, and people actually credited him with saving their lives. It was a very difficult time in America. I saw people living in tents in the wintertime. I saw it with my own eyes. And so Dad became a one-man social service agency. He was constantly helping people insulate they lived in garages, and he would take real thick potato chip boxes and use those for insulation. There's a family that he helped, had a house, but there was no floor in it. It was a dirt floor. And years later, when after Dad had passed away, I was talking to one of the students who had come from the grade school across the street at lunch, and for a quarter you would get a hot dog or a barbecue, bag of potato chips, and a drink for a quarter. And he said that your dad was the most amazing person I ever met. And I said, well, I agree that he said, I couldn't understand why he didn't make any money selling those lunches. I said, how's that? He said, well, there were kids who came for lunch that didn't have the money. And Dad always had reserved lunches for kids with no money. He didn't make any money on that, but he didn't care. He was a cheerful giver. He loved helping those kids in the community around there. And I saw somebody who really, really cared for people. You don't learn that by reading that. You learn it by seeing somebody who was actually involved in it on a day-to-day basis. My hero.
Yeah. And so you kind of took that both in your law practice and as well as in your congressional office, right? Those were kind of that, seeing him do that, you transferred that to your career.
It is, because Dad was the definition of a public servant. He cared more about others than he did about himself. That's the definition of a public servant. Now carry that into Congress and see how many people really believe that's the definition of a public servant. A lot of people, they're not being critical, but there are a lot of people there that they just forget what their mission is. And the mission is to serve the people and not to serve themselves. Most of the people with whom I served had that same mission and the same goal, regardless of party.
And yeah, so and as you kind of said, you were a self-described country lawyer. You did that for people. You really helped your clients. You went above and beyond, not just handling their case, but doing more for them. And then after you had a successful law practice for many years, then you decided you wanted to run for Congress, a dream you had since you were a child. Your two immediate predecessors in Illinois' 16th congressional district at that time were John Anderson and Secretary Lynn Morley Martin. Later, they were both moderate Republicans. They supported the passage of the ERA. They were pro-choice. When you ran in both 1990 and 1992, why did you think the Republican primary voters were more open to having a much more conservative Republican like yourself?
Well, John Anderson, until the last few terms, was quite conservative. And Lynn Martin was quite conservative, except when it came to the issue of pro-choice and pro-life. So these were very conservative people. They didn't make an issue out of where they stood on abortion. I didn't either. I said, this is my view. This is where I think you are. In those days, it was a lot more settled than it is now. And the only issue that came up with regard to that topic would be every few years, making sure the Hyde Amendment, which forbade the use of U.S. taxpayers' dollars for abortions, was whether or not that passed. And that actually passed with a lot of votes from people who would consider themselves pro-choice. So it was not that much of an issue. There were very few votes that were taken at that time. And the community was quite conservative. We used that fact to distinguish me from my opponent, who was John Cox, who was the first Democrat to serve that district in 100 years. And John had I had lost the 1990 primary. And the man who beat me in the Republican primary, after I had been sued by my own party to keep me off the ballot, went on to lose to John Cox, who was a Democrat. John Cox and I have become very close friends. We saw each other at least once a year. And in my book, I make the statement that he's the type of fellow that you want to have watch your kids. If you and your wife want to get away for a weekend, but that his votes did not necessarily copy the votes of most of the people who lived in the district. I put in the book, and this is how much of a politician I was, I wanted to win the election, but I didn't want to see him lose. And I was genuinely concerned when I saw him lose the election. Now, some people think that getting in politics is all about beating up the other person. My parents, who had an Italian restaurant along with my brother for years, said the issue is who makes the better spaghetti sauce. And that's how you can get customers to the restaurant.
There's some wisdom in that.
Yeah.
When you're talking about the 1990 race, which you said you lost the primary in to a party insider, and then also in 1992 when you ran again in order to run against John Cox, you said that you described yourself as an outsider, someone with very little name ID except from your parents' restaurant. Do you think that actually helped you looking back, that no one knew you, that you were not of Washington, not of the machine in Illinois?
Well, I think so. People have been, anytime you're in office one term, you're supposedly an insider and you're part of the machine. And that's not a theme that was just invented within the last decade. It's gone on and on for years. I think what we did was we brought a different perspective. I practiced law in a little town of 3,500 people, raised beef cattle with a small operation. It wasn't a cow-calf operation, but it was enough that they would get out on a Sunday morning and I had to go chasing it with my truck. And we did a lot of traveling from that first campaign in March of 1990 to 1992 in the huge rural area. So it was very easy for people to relate to somebody who came from outside of a town of Egan had 43 people at that time, but the closest town was Byron and it had 3,000. So it always helps to be an outsider, but what had happened, there was massive redistricting at the time. McHenry County got pulled into our congressional district. That's the county that sits on top of Cook County. Massive Republican registration, and all the counties except McHenry, Cox and I were within 1,000 or 2,000 votes of each other. And so the new county actually put me over the line.
So also in your book, you say that when you came into Congress in 1993, after you won in 92, a lot of your fellow freshman Republican classmates had beat incumbent Republicans and were more conservative. Do you think, kind of getting back to my former question, do you think the electorate was just ready for more conservative members at that time? Obviously, at that time, Pat Buchanan was running against, or in 92, against President H.W. Bush. Ross Perot was on the ballot, who he did quite well in your congressional district, the best of any in Illinois. Do you think that that was part of it? Because you talk about Ernest Istook, Pete Hoekstra, who both beat incumbents. Do you think that was a factor there?
It's kind of difficult to answer that because the person that Ernest Istook beat in his primary, and the person that Peter Hoekstra beat in his district had been longstanding Republicans. People were just ready for a change, and you discuss issues, and even my opponent, John Cox, who was a blue dog Democrat, a lot of issues we agreed on, especially fiscal responsibility and how to do that. And he had a plan, and people just want to see a new face on occasions. They saw my face for 20 years and they decided they wanted to see another face. But that's life.
And then so when you got into Congress in 1993, you were kind of put right into the ascent of the Republican majority. You came in the 103rd Congress, and the 104th, they reclaimed the majority after 40 years in the minority. And you talk about, you have a whole chapter on Speaker Gingrich and the kind of that time period. And in that chapter, you also outline his faults and weaknesses, which later led to his downfall. How do you think about Speaker Gingrich and his tactics in retrospect? That he was kind of a visionary figure in some ways, but also couldn't quite get the ball over the line, I think, is kind of what you described.
Newt was an interesting duck. He still is. I think he's a brilliant political strategist, but there's a difference between being a political strategist and the Speaker of the House. They came up with the Contract for America. A lot of that was his doing, and he had actually set up a school on how to get elected, on reaching out to your grassroots base and staying in contact with them, and things of that nature. But he just maybe his ADD was probably worse than mine. I think he had ADHD. because every Wednesday morning we would have what's called a conference. So Republicans would get together at 9 o'clock to talk about what's going on that week in Congress. And every week he would have a different idea. And you just couldn't keep him, straight on it. He had a hard time putting together votes. I mean, he was a likable guy, came out to my district, but he just didn't have the talent. No, he just didn't have the patience to take on working through the legislative system. And I don't say that by way of criticism. Because he had his gifts. When he utilized those gifts, he was brilliant. He's still an interesting guy to listen to.
I've heard a lot of other of your Republican contemporaries at the time say that House Republicans did not have a winning mentality before Newt ascended to leadership. Do you agree with that?
Well, I was only in Congress for 2 years. I didn't know anything. I never held office before. In fact, the first bill that I got passed was with Henry Waxman. I mean, Henry Waxman represented Hollywood. And I represented cows and hogs and soybeans and corn and white collar workers and blue collar workers and people with grease on their hands for working on the machines. But we had three things in common. We were both members of Congress. We both loved America, and we were both short. That's it. But it was an amendment that had to be made to the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. People said you could never get Henry to change something involved in the Clean Air Act. We sat down. It took our staff 6 months to just understand each other. And I mean, nobody was stroking anybody or anything. It's just the institutional distrust between the two parties was so thick that after 6 months, our staff started thinking, they want the same thing we want, and vice versa. And that is to have clean air, but make it so that there's flexibility to meet those conditions. So Henry and I co-sponsored the bill that actually got signed into law by Bill Clinton. So my introduction to Congress was seeing there's a problem and going after it and working on it. I didn't know anything about the institutional distrust. I looked upon him as being a member, an honest member of Congress, representing his constituents. And even though our constituency was different, there still was the issue, how do you deal with dirty air? And we both kept the clean air standards high, but allowed flexibility for the states to meet that. And so that was my introduction, was passing a bill with one of the most liberal members of Congress. And so I didn't, the winning mentality, I didn't really understand that. Mm-hmm. It was nice when we took over the House in 1994, and I had an opportunity to do some other things. But when you go there with a mission of representing your constituency, Grayson, the area that I represented in the mid 1980s led the nation in unemployment at 27%. 27%. When we had the crash in 2008, the biggest city, Rockford, Illinois, led the nation in unemployment at 19% and had the highest percentage of homeowners underwater than any city in the country. I mean, these were the people. City of 150,000 with a family immediate income of $35,000. That's pretty modest. And I actually hired a retired judge to work in my office for the purpose of saving people's homes. I was my dad all over again. Getting gas turned on, getting electricity turned on, calling people all over the place just so my constituents could survive. And those were great times. I mean, not for them, but just in terms of having the ability and the fantastic staff that just threw themselves into the people to help them out.
And then so you talk about many instances like that book, like the financial crisis, all of these bipartisan achievements that you've had. Is that how you believe that you got them done? Is you just approach them as, I'm the representative from Northern Illinois, not a Republican, and you worked out from there?
Well,
basically, what is your secret to getting all that success?
I don't know if there's a secret to it. The issue is I was involved a lot in aerospace industry. Rockford, Illinois has Cummins, which was United Technologies. The district exported $1.5 billion each year. It's a huge exporting district. So I became an expert on everything from mining, which is the beginning of manufacturing, through manufacturing, and went to school for a supply chain, up to export controls. And getting involved in stuff like that, it is so detailed. And I was content to be to sit in the back of the house and not give a lot of speeches because the work was so technical. And members from both parties would come to me because they said, if you have something that's really technical, talk to Don. They didn't say, by the way, the guy's at ADD, I don't know how he does it. To give you an example, Jay Inslee, who's now the governor of the state of Washington, great guy, got a hold of me on the issue of licensing for composers and players for radio. I mean, I can't remember myself. Now, I mean, it was really, really complex. And he knew that if he came to me to be the co-sponsor, that I would really work it, which I did. I worked it very, very hard, and we came to a resolution. I got involved when I found out that the Air Force was in the process of, or the Navy was in the process of awarding the new Marine One to the Italians. Well, I'm Italian American background, and so I got a hold of the Navy and I got the plans. No, these are the plans. They're this thick and probably 2 feet by 2 feet. And I asked the deputy secretary, the undersecretary for acquisitions from the Navy to come to my office. And I said, as I read this, this helicopter can be built, meet the Buy America requirements without one American part on it. He said, yes. Very few people knew that. So I said, would you accompany me to meet with the Connecticut delegation? That's the place where United Technology had its home. And I was there with Senator Chris Dodd, Joe Lieberman, Chris Shays, Nancy Johnson, a few other members, and walked in with the plans. Joe Lieberman got so excited when he found out that that helicopter could be built without American parts that he actually stood up. So that's, how expressionless Joe Lieberman is. And that was one of the meetings where we got back that contract away from the Italians who had gotten the contract, and they screwed it all up. They overpriced it, and so we got it back into the hands of Sikorsky, which was owned by United Technologies. Well, there are no R's and D's in that. The only people we were concerned about was jobs for the people that we work with. And so all of these issues in which I got involved on a bipartisan basis were huge issues. And a lot of people didn't want to get involved in it. We got contacted by the Aerospace Industry of America because of a huge screw up in the regulations involving dual use technology, a civilian use capable of military application. And I worked together with every single group involved in the aerospace industry. And in the end, it took about 2 years to change one sentence. So we got that straightened out, that any FAA certified aircraft parts manufactured in the US were not put on the military list, but could be shipped, with the exception of a few nations, without a license. One company alone in this country picked up an additional $1 billion in exports the first year. And when I got that file and they asked me to get involved, there were 7,000 applications before the military trying to get a license to ship out a product. So it was so bad the Europeans were advertising, we don't have ITAR problems here, buy it from us and not the Americans. So we reversed all of that. Huge effort. I can't tell you the number of members we got involved. We put out a press release. I barely understood it myself. So it was just people that were involved in that industry that, where there's so many, hundreds of thousands of people that were working there. So I got my satisfaction in that. I was sort of a boring person, like to laugh and tell lots of jokes, and was very much of a backbencher, but I enjoyed my world of manufacturing. That's something that never left me. I visited over 500 manufacturing facilities in the US, Asia, and Europe, studied the Swiss system of education for their students as to how they're divided between business and manufacturing, and both parties respect each other as much. We don't have that here. So that was my world, Grayson. It was a fun world to be in, and I was totally oblivious to. I didn't like politics. I didn't like when people say, we'll do this, and then we'll do that, and this will happen here. These guys are all full of crap. They're never right. And why waste your time devising a scheme like that when you've got so many constituents back home that are hurting and need your services?
Yeah. In addition to your manufacturing story and your expo story that you just outlined, you write in the book about many legislative battles you had and the important historical episodes that you were there in Congress for, like your Title X reform amendment and your role in the financial crisis, your recollection of that, respectively. But one thing you don't talk about in the book is what was the toughest vote for you while you were in Congress? Is there one that you really mulled over?
I think the toughest vote was when, as a freshman, I had to vote for something that cost over $1 billion. I had that card. I couldn't even envision how many millions went into $1 billion. But I'd look back, and the vote on the Iraq War, it should have been tough, but it wasn't. And I had the opportunity again, I would have voted against it. But we all voted based upon the knowledge that we had at the time. And the book talks about how could we have been so wrong and get all that intelligence screwed up. But I never really had I had several tough votes, but they weren't votes where you morally seek each other. Perhaps the toughest vote was when I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and there was the annual resolution by the Armenians saying that the Turks were
The
involved
genocide.
with
Mhm.
genocide. The Turks said it wasn't genocide. Mean it officially comes from the top, and they prefer to call it a massacre compared to a genocide. And I was, it should never come for a vote. It was, Grayson, it was so ugly. You had American Turks here and American Armenians here, and they were just scowling at each other. And I eventually, I don't know where it was. I just started weeping. Why are Americans fighting each other? Why are we having this resolution? And I'm not being critical of either group, because they both have good positions on it. And so I looked at it and I said, I studied and studied. I said, this was genocide. And I got a call from President Bush the night before the committee hearing, or a couple nights before. And he said, Don, he said, I'm concerned that the Turks, if this vote goes against them, will withdraw permission from Increlink, or at Increlink, for our military to fly into Iraq. And I said, well, Mr. President, I said, the vote's there. I have to go with history. And then I got a call from the Undersecretary of State, or Deputy Secretary of State, and he asked me about it. And I said, would you call my constituent, who's an expert on this, Steve Theonopoulos? And he did. He runs a Greek restaurant. And then he called me back and said, I talked to Steve. And so what Steve say? Steve said that this is a tough vote, and we trust Don will support him regardless of the way he goes on it. And then I got a call from the admiral, who was in charge of that whole theater over there, urging me to vote no on it. And I said, I understand your position. In the end, I voted yes. Was it a tough vote? Well, the tough vote there was the politics of it versus what actually happened. And I'm not criticizing those who changed their vote. They weren't changing history, but when you're faced with a situation where you would lose a valuable military base over a vote that was going nowhere in the Congress, it's not hard to do that. But that was a difficult vote, because I really admired and respected the President Bush.
In your book, you describe, like I said, a whole bunch of episodes throughout your 20-year career in Congress, a lot of fun, and all the issues you got into. In 2012, the Democratic legislature and Democratic governor in Illinois, they drew you in with another Republican member to minimize the number of Republicans in the Illinois delegation. It was after you subsequently lost the primary in 2012. Was it hard for you to return to Congress and continue working, particularly given that members of Republican leadership came out against you in that race, and your own some members of your own congressional delegation also opposed you, or your opponent?
In life, you have a choice. You become bitter or better. When you become bitter, you accomplish nothing. People get tired of hearing you whine. And bitterness, can cause an ulcer. And I figured, I've been here for 20 years. The Constitution does envision members of Congress losing an election. I lost, I think, by 8 points. It was, in the end, it was the super PACs that did us in. And it was not a great election. I don't talk too much about the details in my book. Just the fact that because of the super PACs, one spent $1 million. You reach a point where every day there's another piece of literature, and we just didn't have the resources to be able to fight back and to keep that seat. So we lost the election, and next day I was sitting on the back porch of the farm. And it was a real nice day, drinking some coffee, and I knew at this point, I said, God's not done with me. certainly came out of a long way from sitting on the front porch of the farm counting cars, to 20 years of meeting with major leaders of the world, including the presidents of China on 2 occasions. And I thought, what am I going to do now? And so I just thought about it, and I said, well, where are my gifts and talents? And I ended up working with the Koreans and running the Korea Economic Institute of America for 5.5 years. I retired for 3 hours from Congress. My term ended, I think it was January 3rd of 2013 at 11:59:59. And at 3 o'clock, I was downtown working with this new organization. Great people, Koreans, just they're some of the most courageous people I've ever met. Just great people. And to see their stamina and how they've been able to maintain their identity for 6,000 years in spite of being invaded hundreds of times, and to be a part of their history and to help them in the halls of Congress, that was quite an honor.
And you also taught after you got out of Congress. Do you still teach a little bit?
I'm an adjunct instructor at Rockford University in Rockford, Illinois. Adjunct meaning that I teach alongside a regular professor who does all of the grading and coursework. And then I bring in additional speakers, and sometimes myself, I will participate. So that's, I don't have the job of actually running that class. That's a lot of work. I mean, I knew that professors worked hard. They never got credit for it, but I just can't believe how hard they work at setting up the curriculum. And then I helped start an institute with another professor there called the Institute on Public Policy and World Affairs at Rockford University. We put on a half a dozen programs a year, some virtual, some live. And the last one we had the former ambassador from the U.S. to Ukraine. They're talking about the Ukraine. Really big names we've been able to bring in, and we just raise a small amount of money, and I have the honor of seeing some of my colleagues come in and people with whom I work. It's very fulfilling. And then this book that has this strange, that someone said, well, when was that picture taken? I said, well, when I first ran for Congress, that was in 1988. It was my wife who suggested it. And I said, well, I do talk about my childhood. She said, no, that's perfect, because most of it's about your years in Congress. The title comes from Frida. When we decided to run, people came up to me and Frida and said, what's a nice guy like Don doing running for Congress? It was repeated so often and so frequently, rather, that Frida said that should be the title of the book. It's a fun book because it takes the reader through a lot of personal things, where my wife almost died, and because of a massive heart attack, and I had to do CPR to bring her back. That's jolting, and then having to decide whether or not to run for re-election in 2012 all at the same time. You dig your way through all these personal things going on in an individual's life, and but the purpose of the book, one of the purposes, is to give hope for people to get into politics. It depends on how you view an individual. Whenever I see anybody, they are a child of God. There's no question about that. And if you just stop there, that gives you an idea of how you're supposed to treat them. Not that I haven't mistreated people. It talks about that in the book. And one time it took me 6 years to track somebody down to apologize them. But you start with that philosophy, and then you think about things such as, soft answer turns away wrath. And words aptly spoken are like an apple that's wrapped in silver and gold. Those are all mostly Proverbs and Psalms. And my faith gave me this perspective that everybody is important, that everybody should be listened to. And some of the most liberal Democratic people in the congressional district used to vote for me all the time. I had a fellow come up to me at a county fair, and he said, really, really sweet countenance. And he said, Mr. Manzulllo, he said, I've never really agreed with you on any major vote that you have taken. And he was not confrontational. He was very kind. And I said, okay. And he said, but every time I wrote to you, you answered my letter and you gave a very cogent reason why you disagreed, even though I never agreed with your answer. And he said, that showed that you were interested in me. And he said, and that's why I have continued to vote for your reelection every time you've been on the ballot. Now, you figure that one out. And that's important to people, is that everybody feels important. I represented 700,000 people one at a time. And I enjoyed those personal encounters.
Well, on that note, I think that's the perfect note to end on. If you're watching this, definitely buy the book. Go to donmanzullo.com, correct?
Yep.
www.donmanzullo.com to get your autographed copy. Thank you so much, Congressman.